Hi, guys. Before getting started, I wanted to just give you a quick backstory. This interview that you're about to see with Bill Cromwell, who I have tremendous respect for, is actually about a platform that they put together for which myself and Siobhan were very excited about. We think it's in many ways representative of where things should be going. And while it may seem a little confusing, given that they're kind of technically a competitor to Own Your Labs, at the end of the day, it's not about us; it's about you. And I just have to say that I loved how their model handles the approach on detection, not just with blood work, but with heart disease in general by checking through a lot of cardiometabolic factors and so forth, which again you'll kind of see in the interview. But graciously, they've also offered to participate in our putting together anonymized data as we do with Own Your Labs. So if you go to precisionhealthreports.com/OYL, you'll see that there's this citizen coupon code, which will actually give you a discount in getting their package. Again, we make no money from this. There's no compensation of any kind outside of they are graciously offering to provide anonymized data to add to our total data pool. So I hope you enjoy this video, and it's again, I think that this really is the future. So I wish them a lot of luck on making this thing grow and grow rapidly.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I'm super excited because I'm being joined with Bill Cromwell, which I believe in your papers, it's listed as William Cromwell. Is that right?
That's it. Yeah.
And I'm gonna tee you up a little bit. You actually have been in the field of lipidology and especially of heart disease for quite some time. Would that be accurate?
33 years and counting.
Wow. So yes, you had been reaching out to me for a while, wanting me to do the blood tests that you were describing. As you know, I already get a huge amount of blood tests in the first place. And full disclosure, I was like, okay, I mean, I will, but I already know that it's going to be going through LabCorp. So I don't, sure, I suppose I'll do it. Eventually I did it. And here's where I'm going to sound almost like a commercial, but I don't mean to be. There's no financial relationship or any compensation you're giving me. I'm going to say that what I was pleasantly surprised to see was that no, it wasn't as simple as here's your lab, now go get your blood work, now bring it back. No, I was happy to see that once I got into your platform, you actually go through a whole bunch of the questions I'm interested in. For example, you were asking about my waist size, you're asking about most recent blood pressure, and a lot of other markers related to metabolism. And this is something where we definitely have a lot of overlap because I think metabolism is perhaps, I mean, it's like sort of lightly acknowledged and perhaps more so now than ever. But even for as much as it's being acknowledged now, I think it's way undercapitalized on, particularly for cardiovascular health. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. And not to take us off the track a little bit, but let me tell you, the thing that has motivated me, Dave, over the past 30 years is how do you do the right thing one person at a time? Right? So our knowledge is ever increasing. We have a model of vascular disease, diabetes, cardiometabolic risk, which is ever improving. Like anything else in medicine, it's something that we shouldn't hold too tightly to. There are things that are important today. There are things that may be more important tomorrow. So how do you let data teach you? How do you let science evolve? How do you let a better picture come into place so that I can look one person in the eye and say, this is the most granular thing I can tell you about the processes that drive your risk of diabetes, heart attack, and stroke. If we can take that view of things, if we can be more integrative in our approach, then metabolism becomes the key. And for some people, it's going to be a story where there's not a whole lot to talk about. And some people, it's going to be a story where there's a whole lot to talk about. And the guidelines have begun to drift gently in the direction of supporting this conversation. And by that, I mean, we're getting away from using major risk factors and calculators as the end all be all. We're embracing the idea that there's a lot under the hood, as some people would say. And these are gently, loosely called risk enhancing factors. Some guidelines have different ones than others. But as we get into discussing your report and what's going on, I want people to just take a sense that our desire is to be very inclusive. We want to take a metabolic focus to diabetes, heart attack, and stroke. We want to benefit from multiple guidelines, not just one, US and international. We want to take advantage of the pathophysiology that we understand of insulin resistance. And we want to be able to not have a general conversation about what these numbers mean for people like you. We want to have a conversation of, let's talk about you. What are your detailed medical values, information, history, risk enhancing factors that just make this the kind of conversation guidelines want us to have, a patient physician informed conversation where you don't have to guess anymore. You can have a really good line of sight as to what's going on. And then if you choose to make changes, how are those changes playing out?
Which again, I think is just fantastic. Certainly, while you're talking about it's driving that way slowly, I want to make a hard turn towards looking much closer to metabolic health, and especially the very things you were describing. For example, how much insulin resistance plays a part in it, which I'm sure we're going to be discussing. But let's go ahead and get to the meat of it. Let's pretend for right now that I went through the process I just described. I went to your site, I filled out that information. Just like I said, it's a form and it's not like 1 or 2 lines. There's really quite a lot that I had to go through. But again, they were all questions that are meaningful to me, and at least at the place where I'm at right now in my research for where I think heart disease, especially, and really many other potential disease states are going to be highly relevant and highly associated. So I love that. We went ahead and prepared a special version of my report, which is redacted. Some parts are redacted, but generally speaking, we're going to be looking at exactly what any patient that's going through this is going to be looking at, right?
Right. That's exactly right.
All right, let's go ahead and jump to it. Do you want to screen share in the report?
Sure thing. Let me just make a click here. And here. And so now you see it. So why don't I just take you, through this gently page by page, and where we need to stop and have a sidebar we can. Does that sound fair?
That sounds great.
Yeah. So the cardiometabolic risk report, as I indicated, is not just the old-fashioned, what are my risk factors and should I be concerned? This report is laid out into sections. The first section is a cover letter, and this cover letter basically makes the case that we're putting a jigsaw puzzle together. And this jigsaw puzzle is informed by some common things that people know about major risk factors. It's informed by various features of insulin resistance. It's informed by a growing number of risk-enhancing factors, which are additional clinical factors guidelines identify as important in having the informed patient shared decision-making conversation. And at the end of the day, we don't see heart attack, stroke, and diabetes as siloed separate entities. We see them as expressions of one common entity, and that is insulin resistance and metabolic disorder, okay? So what you're gonna see on the next few pages are a series of data which are laid out graphically, where you'll have sliders, and these sliders are green on the left and red on the right. Green is low risk or optimal, red is higher risk. And what you'll see from the very beginning, this is our 30,000-foot view. It's going to start with insulin resistance. Under that, it's going to be metabolic syndrome severity. Under that is diabetic risk, and under that is overall cardiovascular risk. So this is designed to give you the most high-level view of detailed information, and then the details come in pages that follow. So in this particular case, the first thing you see is the LPIR score, lipoprotein insulin resistance score. This is a multi-marker, which in multiple different studies has shown some very robust characteristics. Not only is it an excellent indicator of insulin resistance, but more interestingly, as a single composite test of insulin resistance, it's highly predictive of incident diabetes. What you'll find is that a low number is insulin sensitive and a high number is insulin resistant. And so in this case, 20 is about as low as it goes. That's highly insulin sensitive, which is great. The next question is, now this is really talking about how your cells are responding to an insulin signal. Insulin affects liver, muscle, fat cells, as your viewers know, and this is basically a representation of the sensitivity of those cells in responding to that insulin signal. But at a macro level, we know that there are other features of insulin resistance. Many of these have been clustered into the metabolic syndrome, waist circumference, blood pressure, blood sugar, HDL cholesterol, triglyceride. There are other features, including systemic inflammation, atherogenic particle number, And what I find very interesting is that you can take a step forward from just saying categorically, do you seem to have the metabolic syndrome, to asking the question, what do your actual values mean in terms of your diabetic, heart attack, or stroke risk due to insulin resistance? And that is the metabolic syndrome severity score. We can talk about that perhaps as we go along as well. Low is good, high is bad, and 7 is nice and low. So again, these two reinforce each other, very insulin sensitive, without having much to talk about at all in terms of metabolic syndrome severity risk. Diabetic risk is a little different in this report because it integrates glucose and insulin resistance. This is important because at any given glucose level, men and women have a wide range of individual conversion to diabetes over 8 years. We know from MESA and other landmark trials that knowledge of insulin resistance and glucose together help to better discriminate that. And what you can see in this example is an 8-year diabetic risk of 6%, which is low. So far metabolically, this looks very favorable. And the last thing is overall cardiovascular risk. This is something that a lot of people would have different opinions about because we've had varying starting points for the conversation of cardiovascular risk. The pooled cohort equation, your viewers are probably familiar with. This is the current multivariable risk equation that the American College of Cardiology uses to start inferring risk. But that's not the whole story. You should look beyond that to biomarkers, risk enhancing factors. And at the end of the day, you can give a general representation as low, moderate, high, or very high. And for reasons you'll see in a couple of pages, currently it's high. So this is the 30,000-foot view. If you take a little deeper dive, metabolic dive that is, we again start with insulin resistance. We've talked about what that is. On this page, in the center of the page, we give visibility to the detailed information that came from the survey that you were talking about, where individuals say, what is my actual waist circumference, my systolic and diastolic blood pressure, my fasting glucose, my HDL cholesterol, my triglyceride? What is my systemic inflammation as gauged by glyc-A? What is my atherogenic particle number, ApoB? These are all encapsulations, if you will, of that broader insulin resistance syndrome. Now, the coloration is green is normal. And what you see are the 5 features that people talk about with metabolic syndrome. All are normal, all are green. And in this little hurricane diagram, everything above the line that's green says no evidence of what we would call metabolic syndrome. Below the line.
Can I pause you for 1 second? So a few things that are interesting about this. First of all, those first 5 viewers should definitely know that metabolic syndrome, those cut points have been around for some time and do show a robust association. I do like how your graph to the right of this actually is color coding the like in a live output. It shows the atherogenic particle number, for example, is in red. That's going to be different from one person to the next. Somebody else may have green. Somebody else may have their waist measurement be red. I assume if the waist measurement's out of proportion relative to their hip size, things along those lines, so that there's already kind of a little bit of a graphical abstraction of where you consider all of these composite endpoints together. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
That's right. So actually, you don't see it on this one, but if the first 5 features are abnormal, they're yellow.
Gotcha.
And then below that, there is a yellow and a red. So there's a green, yellow, red representation. We're pulling that same visual through in many places through the report. I think people, pretty much get that, green to yellow to red has a continuum associated with it.
But even even the criteria I've noticed just to the left of my values, they appear to be adjusted relative to what my age and probably my sex is, right? So for example, waist size being 40, I'm going to guess that that's relative to my height, right? Same thing with systolic and diastolic pressure. I'll bet that those are adjusted relative to what you would expect would be high risk for my specific profile.
Now, waist circumference is because the current guidelines talk about 2 different adjustments, gender specific and ethnicity specific. So Asians have lower thresholds, women have lower thresholds. So if you are a Caucasian or non-Asian male, it's 40. If you are an Asian male, it's 35. If you are a non-Asian or a Caucasian female, it would be 35. If you're an Asian female, it'd be 32. And so there is an adjustment that the literature has identified as, it is not the case that many ethnicities have the same magnitude of waist circumference, and yet they're insulin resistant. So that's one of the things that has been a moving target in the past, but at least by the guidelines, this is where they've settled in.
But your existing platform is in fact showing the criteria in a dynamic fashion.
Yes, that is correct.
Right, which is what I was kind of calling out, which I think is super important, because once again, if I had just gone and gotten blood work, it would have been broad-based against whatever they determined to be the reference points here. So I love that you actually have not just, where I stand by your own criteria, but also the reference points that you're looking to judge it by.
Yep.
And that it's individualized. So it's pretty cool. Again, back to viewers, I have no stake in what I'm saying, but I do want to emphasize why this, coming from a system standpoint, coming at metabolic health as being something that should be very individualized. Bill, I just love it. I love that you're actually taking this approach with your platform.
Well, I appreciate that feedback, because, this has been a year in the making. I can't tell you how many years went into this before we actually formalized it, but I've tried to emphasize many, many different representations of this. And like you, my bias has been, I want to do the best job one person at a time. I don't want to make this a broad brush stroke. I don't want to make this unadjusted for the things that need to be thought through for an individual patient. Because at the end of the day, what I hope somebody takes away from this is me. This is me as I am now. And because it is a cumulative report, it will show response over time. That's really key, especially when we're emphasizing therapeutic lifestyle as the critical factor, which is often overlooked to improve metabolic health. Medications may be in somebody's future. In my world, that's a last step, not a first step. When you have optimized everything you can optimize and your body says this is as good as it gets, then we have a medication conversation. And I think that's putting things in the right perspective, because one thing you've taught me is how radically we can change in response to various things that we do. And I would not have appreciated that until I saw some of your numbers.
I take that as quite a compliment. But basically, anything you're going to tell me that I've taught you would already be, because you already know so much. For viewers who don't know, Bill and I ended up having lunch the first time we got to meet in person, and to both our surprise, it went 3.5 hours. So we had some good discussions. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but feel free to continue on.
Well, I mean, the hanging chad here is going to be this high ApoB, and we'll have a conversation about that, I'm sure, before this is over. What to make of that, I don't know when I look at this as a single value. Right? So this is something I've said in different ways to different people, but think of any major risk factor as something that can assert itself as a function of magnitude over time. How bad for how long? When you look at a single number, you have no context for that. And that's one of the things I really encourage people to do is when they see an outlying value, put it in context. Do you know how long it's been that way? Is there a way to figure out how long it's been that way? And if you're worried about it, why would you worry about it? Because it's been bad for a long time. If it hasn't been bad for a long time, then it really isn't a conversation point until there is evidence that the end organ is problematic. There's blockage in a vessel, et cetera. That would be a different starting point for the conversation. But if the vessels look good and that number looks bad, it's a problem if it stays there for a long time, we currently think. But you can't just look at a number in isolation and say that for everyone, that number is universally bad without context. So anyway, and then at the very bottom, metabolic syndrome severity score. This is an interesting exercise. There were two researchers, one at the University of Virginia, one at the University of Florida, who I guess basically were concerned that metabolic syndrome, as represented by 3 or more of 5 criteria, was putting people into a box that was not very well discriminating. So if you have 3 features and I have 3 features, would we have the same risk for diabetes, heart attack, and stroke? Not necessarily. And why not? Because the fact that I exceed a threshold does not give me any sort of visibility to the impact of how out of bounds I am. So let's say that my triglyceride is 500 versus 151. That's a big difference.
Right.
And so what this does is in a gender ethnicity specific multi-marker way, validated against the atherosclerosis risk and community study, Jackson Heart study, other landmark trials, comes up with a continuous variable from 1 to 100%, which highly discriminates diabetic heart attack and stroke risk that is associated with features of insulin resistance. And what's interesting is the metabolic syndrome severity score is more predictive than any of the individual elements that are fed into that multi-marker. So it is more predictive than the individual elements taken one at a time. And so for that reason, again, I think it's important that people get better visibility to what does my current metabolic milieu tell me about risk. I have seen examples of people who are all green and are at 50%. I've seen examples of people who have 3 of 5 features and they're less than 50%. I've seen people with 2 features and they're 75%. So this is a very dynamic situation where you can be really deranged in some areas and okay in others, and you're not hitting the categorical threshold that would make people think, oh, you have metabolic syndrome. I want to know how much metabolic risk do you have? And that may or may not be well encapsulated by just 3 or more features.
That's great.
That's the picture for metabolic health. You can also ask the question, well, this interrelates with type 2 diabetes on the left in this diagram, heart attack and stroke risk on the right. So let's look at diabetic risk. As I teed up earlier, glucose is one way to assess risk of diabetes. And the American Diabetes Association would generally say less than 100 is a normal-ish glucose. 100 to 125 is a pre-diabetic glucose, and over 125 on a regular basis is a diabetic range elevation. Well, what you and I know is that at any given number, there is a range of individual risk over time. And that may not be well appreciated by people, but 93 in certain situations will be much more risky than others at 93. And what makes the difference? Well, how well are your cells reacting to insulin? How insulin resistant are you? The more insulin resistant you are at any given glucose, the higher your risk. So this colorful diagram is actually a gender specific diagram. It is for a male as shown here. For a female, these white bars would be actually offset to the right slightly. And what it indicates is that at any given glucose on the y-axis, you'll see a range in the white bar of 8-year diabetic risk. If you're on the left and insulin sensitive, you'll be a lower risk than if you're to the far right and more insulin resistant. So if you just look at this graph on its face, it would say that the higher your glucose, the higher your risk for diabetes. But at any given glucose, there can be quite a wide range depending on whether you're insulin sensitive or insulin resistant. So putting these together in a gender specific fashion allows us to give a better discrimination that in this case, there's about a 6% chance of developing diabetes over 8 years. That's low. This little table at the bottom is not very dynamic in this example because what it does on the top is it says, what does your diabetic risk look like at your current insulin resistance score? And the row below that, what would it look like if you had an optimal insulin resistance score? Well, if you're already optimal, all of these numbers are going to be the same. So it doesn't teach you anything. But in your mind's eye, instead of 20 on the LPIR score, make it 80. If it were 80, you'd be way over here. At 80, you would be much greater risk of diabetes, and these numbers would reflect that. So this I call the what if chart. Again, what are we trying to do? We're trying to emphasize to people that you have a certain metabolic setup now, which is highly modifiable. And if you found yourself in an unfavorable place, a high IR score or a high 8-year diabetic risk, what can you do to improve that? Are you just destined to be diabetic? No, not at all. If you improve your insulin resistance score, you will improve your risk of diabetes at the same glucose. If you lower your glucose, you'll improve your diabetic risk at the same IR score. If you improve both your glucose and your IR score, you will come smartly down into the green instead of being somewhere potentially in the red. So this is a very, very dynamic, and I can show examples of patients that I've worked with through the years who've understood this and made this a significant lifestyle adjustment, many of whom have gone from 50% or higher diabetic risk to less than 10%. In many cases, they do their own self-experiment of, I wonder what happens if I go back to my old ways. And they quickly pop right back up and they say, oh, I guess that didn't work. So it's reinforcing, right? It tells you what isn't working, what is working, and maybe what you can get away with, right? So all of that, I think, is, you would know this better than anybody. You've got more data for yourself than any one person I know. You can really dial in what effect you're looking for, good or bad, I guess.
I believe I have something in the neighborhood of over, well, I think at this point I have probably 130 LPIR scores between all the blood work. Right. Since November of 2015. Again, because of the experiments, I get an NMR with every single test that I do. And that comes with the LPIR score. And the LPIR score is almost always showing for me as an under 25, save a few key experiments. And one experiment you may not have known about is in 2018, I literally gained about 20 pounds for the purpose of seeing what it would do with my lipids, checking insulin levels, and then on the way down, switching back from a standard American diet to a ketogenic diet in a very controlled fashion. I was capturing wide spectrum blood tests on the way down to see what was happening with all of these. And the LPIR score, unsurprisingly, tended to correlate with what I would consider to be better health markers and my own personal status. I've been especially interested in that composite score for a while. And as I'm sure you're well aware, we had a very powerful, I think it was a retrospective study that got released earlier this year. I think it was the Women's Health Initiative, or was it the it was a study that had a large female population for which LPIR was shown to be something like 8 or 9 times more of a hazard ratio compared to like the second risk factor underneath it. Again, don't quote me on this. I'd have to get it in front of me, but it really had a new level of eye-opening data to show the strength of that association with LPIR in particular.
Right. And that's one of many prospective cohorts that have, now the advantage of that is it's 20-year data. Other is 10-year data. So various degrees of epidemiologic prospective follow-up with incident events, either in this case, diabetes or heart attack or stroke. So all of that helps inform us. And one of the things that you're aware of is that we've spent a lot of time and a lot of energy over the past 20 years, specifically asking more probing questions to understand how robust these associations are. So a good 20, 25 years of my life have been spent with Jim Otvos and others seeking to understand, and having collaborators have been very helpful in that. So to date, nearly 700 peer-reviewed papers, over 17, 18 million samples run. We've learned a lot. So the one thing we have is a pretty good understanding of the performance of some of these things. Now the question is, how do people get this information and then in a guided fashion make the adjustments, the lifestyle interventions that are necessary to see the improvement that can be had?
Yeah, it's great.
So when we get to cardiovascular risk, this is the integration of what I call the old and the new. The old has been some type of risk calculation exercise to get the ball rolling. In the day, it was Framingham, then it was Reynolds risk score, then it was many other ones. The one which is currently in vogue is the pooled cohort equation. If you can read these words at the top, it just reminds people that age, gender, race, total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, diabetic status, blood pressure, smoking, medications, all feed into a 10-year and a lifetime representation of risk. 10-year is, as the name implies, what's your chance of heart attack and stroke in 10 years. Now, if you are younger, 10 years is not the end of your universe. You would like to think 25, 30 years, right? So I'm a fan of lifetime risk in younger people because it's a much better conversation. I have seen so many times where people have low 10-year risk and something not optimal or high for lifetime risk. One of the quips that I stole from Sergio Fazio, who's a lipidologist, used to be at Vanderbilt and he went to Oregon, but Sergio has a way of turning a phrase. And he says, you're never lower than your highest risk. And I kind of like that, right? So you're never lower than your highest risk. If somebody says, I've got 5 things that make me low risk, but one thing that's validated that makes me high risk, I wouldn't consider I'm low risk. I may not be high risk, but I'm certainly not low risk because there's something else that's pulling me in that direction. So this, I think, should be understood as a generalization based on these variables over a 10-year or lifetime field of view. What is interesting to me are what are called risk enhancing factors. If you look at the ACC guidelines, the European Society of Cardiology guidelines, the American Diabetes Association guidelines, National Lipid Association guidelines, variety of guidelines, there are many, many clinical situations that are called out as being important in integrating into an individual's risk. And these are very interesting. Some people may not know of it. For example, for females, preeclampsia is a risk enhancing factor. Premature menopause, risk enhancing factor. Inflammatory diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, HIV, all risk enhancing conditions. High particle number, risk enhancing condition. High Lp(a), risk enhancing condition. There are over 30 of these. And all of these are captured in that survey that people take when they are getting the information necessary to generate this report. Sleep apnea, other things, right? So you want to have a very broad field of view on that. And why is that important? Because it gives better visibility to the dynamics that an individual has in their mix that can contribute to their risk, some of which are modifiable, some of which are not. South Asian ancestry, can't do much about that, but clearly it is a source of risk that isn't captured in many of the risk calculators. What you see here is a reflection of the fact that there is an LDL cholesterol greater than 190, ApoB greater than 160, non-HDL cholesterol greater than 220. This would be above the 98th percentile. That's pretty high. And so again, going back to what we think is the causal exposure model of atherosclerosis, the longer you're exposed to a punitive factor at high concentration, the more impact it has. And so I tell people it's only scary if you stay there, right? Granted that we're still trying to figure out the magnitude of incident risk that these biomarkers can have in certain situations, but with a lot of experiments of nature underneath our belts, including FH on the one hand and hypobeta on the other hand, there is a general trending of risk as a function of how high and how long people maintain atherogenic particle excess. So that's a good general statement. There are a lot of ways that may or may not be true, but that's what we begin with, right? So when you put all this together, you'd say that your lifetime risk represented here at 50% would be high. There are other factors which would also add risk. So we'll say, yeah, overall risk would appear to be high.
Right. And to be sure, just to kind of put a few things in perspective, because I don't want people to miss it. You said that my levels would be above 98%. So it needs to be emphasized, as I try to do as often as I can, Bill. While you know that I can be, and I use the phrase cautiously optimistic with regard to this context of metabolic fat adaptation, the reason I frame it that way is that's a claim of uncertainty. Even if I have a leaning, I really don't know. And that it's understandable why there would be many people, particularly professionals at your level, who would say, you know, it's one thing to say, hey, maybe an LDL of, I don't know, 180, which might be, say, above the 70% or 80% watermark. It's just going to feel very different than what we're looking at on my levels here, where I have like an LDL of, say, 271 with an ApoB of 183. These are levels you don't typically see outside of populations that already have some kind of genetic disease, such as monogenetic FH, even at least at heterozygous levels, to observe this. This is kind of a new phenomenon that certainly I'm very interested in studying a lot of, but that I'm going to guess you're having more and more patients that exhibit this. Again, without my wanting to acknowledge this, without necessarily encouraging it, it is something that I could understand why it would be as concerning. Right.
Right. So just to maybe extend that thought a little bit, I see a lot of people who show up with bad numbers, and these are not unusual numbers for people I take care of. I'm a lipidologist. I'm one of 2 lipidologists in a 1 million person area. I have families of FH that, you know, are, as you expect, are all over the board. I've got all sorts of polygenetic folks that are all over the board. So it is a very, very common day in my office to see numbers like this. That's only because, you know, people concentrate in my office with these numbers, not because it's common for the general population. So when I see this, the things I have to have as a conversation is, How long has it been this way? What do your vessels look like? That's where we start the conversation. And in some cases, people were diagnosed at a very young age, and they say, no, this has been me for a long time. Got it. In other cases, I don't know. This is the first time I've had a look. In some cases, they're at an age where picking up atherosclerosis is a little more difficult with existing tools because, when you're 30, you have only had 30 years of potential exposure. That's if you were born that way, much less if it happens sometime during your childhood or early adolescence. And so it does take cumulative exposure for atherosclerosis to be picked up in one way or another, right? And so I think people need to be a little cautious about looking at this as we don't know that it's a problem. We know that there are populations characterized in this way genetically for whom it is a problem over time. So we can say that. We also have to be careful to say anybody at 271 has plaque already. We don't know that. I don't know that somebody has plaque at 271. They may, in many cases. I wouldn't be shocked if they did, given the cumulative exposure of a 271 over time, right? But I do think we need to keep the conversation open enough to say context is meaningful. How high for how long? And then what do your vessels look like? If we can kind of open the conversation to that, I think it's a more representative conversation of the literature. It still allows for the very strong association of atherogenic particle number that has been shown in any number of different contexts. But at the same time, it also opens the door for the fact that this is something that can be improved either by lifestyle or medication. And in many cases, I have seen people who are, as some people describe them, lean mass hyperresponders, can make these numbers much different with adjustments in their lifestyle.
Naturally, I'll want to chat with you about that after we get through our report. I think we're close to the end at this point, right? Or
we are, because what we're going to do now is just highlight something on the bottom and then unpack a couple of pages. So the guidelines, as you know, have recommendations for what these values should look like if you wanted to lower cardiovascular risk. One point of reference is a % reduction, and the other point of reference is an absolute target, okay? So a % reduction would be 50% reduction for high risk and very high risk. So you just take half of these numbers if they're not on therapy, and you see those as one representation of a number to shoot for. Another representation is called minimal goal and optimal goal. And this really reflects the fact that the US guidelines and the European guidelines are a little different in how aggressively they target these numbers. The US guidelines are a bit more conservative. The European guidelines are a bit more aggressive. And the reason is because most recent outcome data from Fourier and PCSK9 trials have allowed us to get new observations of what happens to people who achieve very, very low LDL cholesterol over many years. And what's interesting to see is that the event reduction, the reduction in heart attacks and strokes, continues to be linearly related to how low your LDL is, all the way down to 10. So is there continued clinical event reduction as you go below 50? Yes. Below 30? Yes. Below 20? Yes. Is it of the same linear relationship? Yes. So one answer is there is not a point at which we don't get additional benefit by achieving and maintaining more aggressive reductions. The other hand is, are there risks associated with that? And what do we see as far as risks in individuals who were 25 and below versus 50, 70, and 100? And the answer is no difference between those individuals less than 25 versus those achieving LDL cholesterols 50, 70, 100. So as these outcome studies have been performed, we don't see a signal for risk. We do see a signal for benefit. And that has caused the guidelines to not have a view that you stop at any particular point. The numbers that you see in the green are called thresholds. You stay below them, but you don't stop when you get to them. So if you had reason by virtue of having had a heart attack, a stroke, or significant plaque, and you say, I really need to get this thing down, then do I stop at 100? No, that's a minimum acceptable value. Do I stop below 70? No, that's a minimum acceptable value, depending on which guideline you're following. If I could get to 50, would that be good? It could be. Is that likely to give me more risk? Not based on the guidelines and the outcome data, but everybody's an individual. This is the informed conversation. But at least we have data now in randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trials where 13,000 individuals have a median LDL cholesterol of 26, and they're followed that way for years. So now we at least have data to indicate there's a reason from a benefit perspective that you could do well down there, and we don't see a safety signal that's different for those people. That's part of the conversation. So then when we look at that little bar graph or a QR code to give people some additional information, these are cumulative tracking pages. And as more data is collected over time, the chart at the top fills in and the data points connect going left to right. There's a line here for glyc-A below 400 would be favorable. Metabolic syndrome severity less than 25% would be favorable. Maintaining below the red and below the yellow would be favorable, and people can see how they're doing over time. Let's assume somebody doesn't start with all green, and let's assume somebody starts at a value above what's favorable. Well, through lifestyle intervention, you would expect to see these values trending toward improvement over time. Same thing can be said on the next page, which looks at glucose, LPIR score, 8-year diabetic risk. Here's the line for LPIR score. Here's the line for 8-year diabetic risk. This is where we'd like to be. For those people who are above those values, changes over time, we would hope would connect the dots and show an improvement, if not maintenance below these values. And then for atherogenic particle number, there's a minimum, there's an optimum. Lipid values are at the top, particle number is at the bottom, here shown as ApoB. And again, this allows for cumulative tracking over time. One of the things that we have done with this report is we've also added some context around this. All right, so your atherogenic particle values are high. There are links here where you can click on this to get more information. And what this is going to tell you is there are secondary etiologies to be aware of: liver disease, thyroid, kidney, glucose. There are genetic things that you'll need to have a conversation about. There's context to put around this. Again, trying to give people some of the conversation that you and I have talked about. And then same thing's true for atherogenic particle number. In cases where people have not had any sort of non-invasive imaging, in many cases, there's a prompt that comes up that says non-invasive imaging could be helpful. Again, just to allow people the opportunity to say, if you haven't looked at your arteries, you might want to, because it's an important piece of information to try to put this in context. Again, we're trying to be very open about the various things that inform the values and what might be a good conversation you have with your healthcare team.
That's great.
As we go down, these are the actual responses that people give when they take the survey, such as, any non-invasive imaging, 0 coronary calcium score at 48, et cetera. Also, things that people may or may not be aware of. Family history of manifestations of FH are typically not known to people, things like thickened Achilles tendons and whatnot, but some people know. These are all different types of risk-enhancing factors that weren't captured somewhere else. And again, you can see the values down here is no. And then the actual LabCorp printout, which in itself has information, but not nearly in the type of context we tried to create above. So that is the Precision Health Report, Cardiometabolic Risk Report.
That's great. Again, like I said, I think overall it really covered a lot more in a robust manner that I would be especially interested in. It's why I actually was getting more excited about actually having this discussion. I figured we'd be kind of talking, and I would like to actually talk to you a little bit more on the aspects of metabolic health overall, and what, if anything, we may find that this phenotype you mentioned earlier, lean mass hyperresponders, actually originates from my 2017 article from before. And we actually hope to have some paperwork coming to the literature soon on that, by the way. But more on that soon enough.
Depending on how granular you have that data, I'd be happy to provide some additional context with some of these parameters that we're talking about. That might be some interesting additional information beyond what you already have.
The higher LDL is something of considerable concern. And I know that you were on Rob Wolf recently, and you were describing lean mass hyperresponders from your perspective. They have a disordered lipid profile. Is that a fair characterization of your opinion?
So let's go back for a second. I like the way you teed up the interface between catabolism, anabolism, and metabolism. And then, so that's one perspective to kind of come into the conversation with. A different perspective to come into the conversation with is, what does disordered lipoprotein metabolism look like in various states? And so I think you and I have kind of drifted toward the middle, me coming from the pathophysiologic standpoint and you coming from the physiologic standpoint. And those are two different schools of thought. One is looking for, there are things that we think are wrong and have gone wrong, and why are they wrong? And then there are things that are the way the body works that can drift over into a phenotype that looks like things that have been characterized as bad or abnormal. And so when they intersect, what does that mean? And that's really, I think, what you and I have kind of tried to wrestle with a little bit, is how we come to this from our worldviews, and what does that inform us as far as ways that we take something that is not real common, that has only partially been characterized, that has not been systematically studied, right? And so I think that's kind of the confession of where we are with, kind of how do we view something which is, at its core, does that kind of have a warm feel to it, or does it have a bristly feel to it? And so in my world, things that are atherogenic lipoproteins in large quantity over a long time with extraordinarily rare exception is bad. That's just bad. All right. This can be remnant lipoproteins that are very atherogenic. These can be ApoB containing lipoproteins like LDL that are problematic. And we just know a lot of different examples where high values for a long time equals atherosclerosis and events and things that aren't good. Now, can there be exceptions to that rule? Yes. And part of the exception, I think, is a time dependency of the observation. If it's not your usual and customary day in and day out for long periods of time, who knows whether that's going to have that sort of negative impact that we fear, right? On the other hand, we should be careful that by not having the answer to that it's okay to leave people in that state for decades, because, what could go wrong? And I think, to me at least, it's easier to have the conversation. Are there physiologic abnormalities that I can identify, as well as evidence of plaque? And once I get into that sort of subset of individuals, then I'm pretty convinced that this is not a good thing and we need to do something about it. Now, if I can't identify that, then I'm open to the idea that these can represent new learnings in either energy metabolism or other types of compensatory reactions that we have under certain physiological circumstances. And it is of unknown consequence, and that's okay too. I'm okay with that. So driving the conversation from the physiology is normal. If we do this, I kind of run into some thin water there. When I come at it from this is what disease looks like, and what we've been doing for 30 years to understand that, that's my deep end of the pool. And so where we kind of come together, I get a little shallow at some points. And when you get shallow, you kind of default back to that which you know best. So just to let you know, that's kind of what I see in this.
Yes. Well, and this is why I kind of want to link it back to the report, in that it could look graphically like, oh, great, I have all of these greens, and just that like one red, I'm good, I'm going to head out of here. No, actually, to be fair, I think there's some validity to saying, look, given our existing understanding of the lipid hypothesis, we already do have some analogous scenarios. At least that's what's posited by Brown and Goldstein going back half a century ago, which is, we have children who are born with homozygous FH who do not have other risk factors. They're not already smokers. They're not morbidly obese. They don't have hypertension or type A personalities, all of the things you would typically associate. Yet, in fact, if memory serves, the little girl that we're looking at, the very first one that kind of got them going, she had roughly 700 LDL. At the time that they were looking, she had developed xanthomas and even angina at age 3, and had her first MI at age 6. So there definitely is this association that is felt to be predominantly driven by ApoB containing lipoproteins. Where this gets kind of interesting is getting back to what you're talking about is the existence of disease. So nothing, in my opinion, nothing quite trumps actual detection of the physical presence of atherosclerosis, which is why myself, I like CT angiograms, for example. I think that it's great because you can then look not only at calcified, but also non-calcified plaques. Do you already have some at baseline? Regardless of whether you became a lean mass hyperresponder or not, I think that's a super relevant question. I'm sure you would agree. And exactly like what you just said now, what if they have been for a while, but they don't have detectable levels of plaque? Is that, time to stop looking? I don't think so. I think that this new phenotype really does need close examination, particularly in whether we see the presence of disease or, for that matter, the progression of disease, which is why we're doing the clinical trial. I think we need to find out more for sure.
So what I would add to that is FH, true FH, is a high lifetime atherosclerotic risk condition. We don't even do risk calculators in FH patients because they have high lifetime atherogenic risk, period. Now, you may have an outlier who gets away with it. That doesn't change the statement. It's like saying I smoke 2 packs a day and I don't have COPD or lung cancer, therefore smoking is good. Obviously, it's not. But there are people who can smoke and get away with it more than others. That's an example. And it's a graded risk factor, right? The more you smoke, the longer time, the more impact it has. True for hypertension, true for all the other major risk factors that we have. So one of the things we can say with FH is that, again, individuals are individuals, but at the same time, it is well established that trapping of ApoB containing lipoproteins in the artery wall leads to inclusion in macrophages, forming of foam cells, and foam cells are the committed step of atherosclerosis. So if your pathophysiology pulls you in that direction, where you're getting lots of foam cell formation due to trapping and inclusion of ApoB-containing lipoproteins, that needs to stop. That is not something which should be entertained as okay. So there are many, many layers to that conversation. And I like the fact that we can have imaging technologies that give us better views than we had in the past. But I would say that any objective evidence of atherosclerosis puts us in a different conversation than if we don't. And any time that we have historic, and this is another interesting idea. I had a 75 or so year old lady come to me recently, second opinion. I don't want to take a statin. And I said, well, why are you taking a statin? Well, she says, I'm not. My doctor wants me to take a statin. Well, why does he want you to take a statin? Because I've got an LDL cholesterol of 200. Interesting. How long has it been that way? You're the first doctor to ask me that. She pulls out a 3-ring binder and she can show me that 5 years previously is when she started to raise her LDL cholesterol. Okay, so now you don't have a long exposure risk. Secondly, what else is causing it? She was hypothyroid, hadn't been diagnosed. So now we have a secondary hyperlipidemia due to hypothyroidism that manifested with high LDL cholesterol, and the knee jerk was give a statin. And the rest of the story was hadn't been there that long, no evidence, and coronary calcium was zero. The guidelines say that at her age, a 0 de-risks her and makes statins optional for at least 5 years. So, again, this dynamic conversation of I see the number, what does it mean? How long has it been there? What are your arteries doing? Is a better quality conversation to have going into what are my options? Should I be worried? Should I do something different?
Well, we're both kind of coming up on a hard stop. I just wanted to thank you once again, Bill, for coming on. And can you tell us again, how do we go and get this report?
Sure. So Precision Health Reports is the company. www.precisionhealthreports.com is our website. So individuals can order the report. It's also something that physicians and healthcare providers can order as well. That's where the information is easiest found. It's also social media, and you can find us on LinkedIn and Twitter and all that other good stuff.
Now, I'm pretty active on Twitter and social media. You're maybe not as active on Twitter.
You're being very kind.
Do you have?
It's a pay grade above me.
No, actually, I regularly joke, and it's not even really a joke, that I know when somebody's smarter because they're not on Twitter like me. So don't worry about that. Is there any way that you'd recommend people try to get a hold of you if they need to?
Sure. So first initial, last name, W. Cromwell at precisionhealthreports.com. That's the email they can find me. I did do a little series on Twitter recently, one that was just trying to tee up this idea of shared decision making. And what does that look like? You know, how are we moving from a risk factor model to a model which is more inclusive of the type of things we report? And I found making threads and whatnot very challenging. So anyway, I enjoy having these conversations more. Looking forward to hearing from folks and seeing what we can do to help.
Well, once again, as the Venn diagram goes, even if we occasionally get caught up discussing lipids, I mean, there's so much of what you have here that just overlaps with the things I care about. So I really appreciate it. I think you guys are heading in the right direction, and I hope to see this model thrive. Not just with you, but just in general with this multifaceted approach to giving a better risk analysis. So once again, Bill, thanks for coming on, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Dave. Take care.